The sky above Everwind National Park was painted in shifting shades of gold and indigo as I pulled my truck to the edge of the gravel loop. I cut the engine and let the silence settle around me, feeling the air change as day slipped reluctantly into dusk. I was finishing my last patrol of the day, a routine check of the north perimeter, but something about the stillness made my skin crawl. The birds had gone quiet, their usual evening chatter swallowed by an unsettling hush. I glanced up through the treetops, watching the last beams of sunlight catch the tips of branches, flickering like candle flames about to snuff out. My gut tightened, though I told myself it was just the usual creep of evening shadows. Still, I lingered, listening, hearing only my own breath and the faint creak of the trees as the wind stirred. The fading light made the familiar trail seem deeper and darker, as though it might swallow me whole if I stepped too far from the truck. I stepped out of the truck, boots crunching softly against the gravel, and grabbed my flashlight from the passenger seat. Even though there was still enough light to see, I didn't like the way the trees seemed to lean closer in the growing dusk. It was as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. I adjusted my ranger hat and stepped onto the trail, my flashlight heavy in my hand though it wasn't switched on. The air was cooler now, the warmth of the day fading into a creeping chill that raised goosebumps on my arms. I told myself it was just the temperature dropping, but the shadows felt heavier than usual, pooling between the trunks of trees like dark water. I glanced behind me at the truck, tempted to turn back and call it a day, but I'd always taken pride in finishing my rounds, even when the forest felt strange. With a resigned breath, I moved forward, listening for the snap of a branch or the distant rustle of something unseen. The trail twisted ahead, winding deeper into the thickening woods, and with each step, the world behind me seemed to fade away. My footsteps grew softer on the dirt path, muffled by a layer of pine needles that dampened the sound, making me feel as though I were walking into a dream. The last light of the sun bled through the trees in narrow slashes, casting strange shapes that flickered in my peripheral vision. I kept my flashlight ready, thumb hovering over the switch, though I still hadn't turned it on. A faint rustling came from somewhere off the trail, low and quick, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, listening intently, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me with the echo of my own heartbeat in my ears. The forest ahead seemed darker now, the trees packed tighter, branches clawing toward each other overhead. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows just beyond my sight, waiting for me to step closer. I finally clicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting a pale slice through the gathering gloom, but the light only seemed to push the shadows further back, thickening them like a living thing. My footsteps slowed as I scanned the trees ahead, the beam catching on gnarled roots and low branches that suddenly seemed far more sinister than before. Another faint rustling sounded behind me, this time closer, as if whatever had been lurking had moved a few steps forward. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing there. Just the same silent trees and the fading streaks of dusk beyond them. I swallowed hard and told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, nothing to worry about. But my skin prickled, and I felt that crawling sensation along my neck, as though invisible eyes were still locked on me. Against my better judgment, I kept going, each step feeling heavier than the last. The trail narrowed as I pressed on, the trees closing in so tightly I had to duck under low-hanging branches, the leaves brushing against my shoulders like cold fingers. The beam from my flashlight trembled as my grip tightened, the light wavering across the undergrowth. Another sound reached me, a soft, almost rhythmic tapping, like bare feet stepping lightly on the packed dirt. I froze mid-step, ears straining, the pulse pounding in my temples. The tapping paused as though it knew I was listening, and then resumed, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I shone the beam back and forth, but it revealed nothing, only trees and the darkening trail behind me. My rational mind whispered it was just an animal, a trick of sound, but something deeper screamed it was wrong. The tapping wasn't random, it was deliberate, measured, following me. A sudden chill twisted through my gut as I realized I wasn't alone out here. I wanted to turn back, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the trail behind me looked darker, less familiar, as though the woods had shifted while I wasn't looking. My pulse thudded louder, a steady drumbeat in my ears. I called out, my voice cracking slightly as it echoed into the trees. "Hello?" Anyone out here?" Silence answered me, thick and absolute. The tapping had stopped, but now the air felt denser, as if the trees themselves were listening. I forced myself to keep moving forward, one cautious step at a time, the flashlight's beam jerking left and right. A low, almost inaudible whisper seemed to rise from the darkness, like wind through dead leaves. But it wasn't wind. It was words. I couldn't make them out, but they scraped against my nerves, setting every hair on my body on end. I gripped the flashlight tighter, swallowing the bitter taste of fear as I tried to convince myself it was only the wind. I quickened my pace, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the trail as I stumbled forward, every muscle tense and ready to run. The whispering grew louder, though it still seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I could almost make out words now, something that sounded like my name but distorted and stretched, as if spoken through a wall of static. My chest tightened as I realized I wasn't imagining it. Something was in these woods with me. I turned sharply at a faint scuffing noise off to my right, the beam landing on a twisted tree with bark as pale as bone. My heart leapt into my throat when I saw something move, just beyond the edge of the light, a shape darker than the shadows. I strained to see, but the thing melted into the gloom, leaving only the echo of my own shallow breathing and the rush of blood pounding in my ears. I spun around, desperate to catch sight of it again. I stumbled back, my breath ragged and uneven, the flashlight shaking in my grasp as I swept it across the thick undergrowth. My voice cracked as I called out again, louder this time. "Who's there?" But the woods swallowed my voice whole, offering only the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches in response. The shape, whatever it was, had vanished, but the weight of its presence lingered like a hand pressed between my shoulder blades. I turned in slow, panicked circles, the light catching nothing but empty trail and twisted trunks. My gut clenched, an ancient primal fear blooming in my chest. I felt like a rabbit caught out in the open, knowing the predator was just beyond sight. I tried to backtrack toward the truck, but every turn looked unfamiliar now, the trail behind me disappearing into tangled shadows. I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that I was lost, completely and utterly alone, with darkness closing in. Panic clawed at me as I spun in place, desperate to find any sign of the path back to my truck. The flashlight's beam caught a glint of something metallic half buried under the leaves, maybe a lost piece of equipment. But I didn't have time to investigate. The whispers had returned, louder now, weaving through the trees like a cold, sneering wind curling around my neck. My voice cracked as I shouted for help, but the forest swallowed my words, answering only with silence and that same slow, deliberate tapping echoing through the shadows. I forced myself to stay calm, taking deep breaths to steady my trembling hands. Somehow, I knew the forest wasn't just a place anymore. It had become something else, something hungry, watching, waiting. The chill inside me grew unbearable, and I realized I couldn't trust my senses. The woods were playing tricks, and I was the prey in their twisted game. I ran without looking back, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted through thick underbrush, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The tapping followed me, louder, faster, and closer, echoing through the trees like footsteps chasing my every move. I didn't know what I was running from, only that it wanted me gone, or worse. Branches scraped my arms and tore at my jacket, but I didn't slow. Panic and adrenaline pushed me forward until suddenly, I burst through the trees onto the gravel loop where I'd left my truck. The fading light caught the truck's roof as the headlights flickered on, a beacon in the growing dark. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking every bolt. I pressed my back against the seat, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. Outside, the forest stood still and silent, as if it had never chased me at all, but I knew better. I would never forget those footsteps, or the feeling of unseen eyes burning into me, waiting in the dark. I was a ranger for the Mourne Mountains, a stretch of wild, rugged peaks and valleys in Northern Ireland that rarely drew more than the occasional hiker or camper. The days were quiet, the nights quieter still. But one morning, just as the sun cracked over the granite peaks, I received a panicked call from a man camping near the Glen River. He was babbling about something horrific, his voice trembling as he pleaded for help. I drove out, expecting an injured hiker, maybe someone spooked by an animal. But what I found was worse. The camper was pale, shaking, and could barely explain what he'd seen. All he could say was that something had slaughtered a flock of sheep nearby, and that he felt watched all night. His words echoed over the stones and pines, and I felt a prickling at the base of my neck, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, listening to his dread. I climbed higher into the Glen River Valley later that afternoon, retracing the camper's steps with a creeping sense of unease gnawing at me. The wind had picked up, whispering through the high pines and rustling the tall grasses as if the mountain itself was breathing. When I reached the flock, I stopped cold. The sheep had been torn apart, their bodies splayed open in grotesque disarray, the grass stained dark with blood. There were no tracks, no wolf, no fox, only deep gouges in the earth, as if something massive had raked the ground with claws. I knelt down, feeling the weight of the silence, the sky above thick with clouds threatening rain. I radioed in for help, but the static swallowed my voice. Something unseen was threading itself through the trees, and I had the sickening realization that whatever had torn these animals apart was still nearby, perhaps even watching me now. I didn't linger long among the ruined flock. As I trudged back downhill, my eyes constantly scanned the woods, the crunch of twigs under my boots sounding unnaturally loud. Even the birds had gone silent. The radio remained useless, and my phone displayed no signal. By the time I reached the old stone bridge crossing a ravine, I realized dusk had fallen, the shadows lengthening around me like grasping fingers. I felt the weight of isolation pressing down, a heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched. Suddenly, from behind a boulder near the bridge, I heard a low, guttural growl, not quite human, but not entirely animal either. My breath caught, and I froze, straining to pinpoint its source. The growl rose again, closer now, echoing off the stones and mingling with the distant sigh of wind. My pulse thundered in my ears as I realized I was no longer alone. I inched backwards, my heart hammering as the sound of rustling leaves intensified. A shadow detached itself from behind the boulder, a tall, gaunt figure with limbs too long and a head cocked at an unnatural angle. Moonlight glinted off pale skin, and I caught a glimpse of hollow eyes, black as night. The figure crept forward, silent except for the rustle of dry leaves beneath its feet. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and landed hard on my side. Gasping, I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline flooding my veins. The figure advanced, each step slow and deliberate, as if savoring my terror. I turned and bolted down the path, branches slapping at my face, lungs burning. My ears caught a sound behind me, laughter low and guttural, rising and falling like a chant. It seemed to seep into the trees, into the soil itself, pursuing me as I fled deeper into the woods. I sprinted, heart pounding in my chest like a war drum, my breath ragged in the chilled night air. The laughter echoed, growing louder, until it felt as though it was right behind me, brushing the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a fleeting glimpse of the pale figure gliding through the trees with inhuman grace, never touching the ground. My foot snagged a protruding root, and I crashed to the forest floor, my palms scraping against wet moss. I barely registered the pain, pushing myself up, but my legs trembled beneath me. The figure was closer now, its face elongated, a maw opening where its mouth should be. I scrambled to my feet and lunged forward, the trees blurring around me. The path twisted wildly, my pulse throbbing in my temples, but the laughter only grew louder, more insistent, as though the very woods were mocking my futile escape. A clearing opened before me, the moonlight pouring down like a silvery spotlight on the glistening grass. My legs screamed for rest, but the figure was closing in, its grotesque silhouette emerging from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. I spun around, desperate, and stumbled backward into the heart of the open space, feeling exposed, as though under the scrutiny of some malevolent eye. The laughter swelled, and the figure glided forward, its pale limbs elongated, its fingers branching into shadowy tendrils that seemed to pulse with life. I dropped to my knees, breathless and trembling, the forest spinning around me. The trees, once a safe perimeter, now seemed to press inward, their gnarled branches twitching in anticipation. The figure's laughter broke into a chorus, dozens of voices layered upon one another, filling the clearing with a crescendo of taunting glee. A wave of panic crashed over me as the figure's tall shadow stretched slowly across the clearing, swallowing the weak moonlight like a living fog creeping closer. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it would give away my hiding spot. each beat echoing in my ears like a warning drum. The voices swirled around me, dozens of layered whispers, sneers, and sinister murmurs that twisted the cold night air into something thick and suffocating. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to flee, but the ground beneath felt strange, almost alive, pulsing with a dark energy that slowed my every step. Behind me, the trees appeared to shift, their branches curling and reaching like grasping claws. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the figure, as if it relished the scent of my fear. Trembling, I grabbed a broken branch, bracing myself to fight whatever nightmare was closing in fast. The figure moved with an unnatural, eerie grace, gliding silently through the underbrush like a shadow come to life. Its outline was faint, barely visible against the thick darkness, as if it belonged to the night itself. My heart pounded, panic twisting my stomach as I stumbled backward, tripping over gnarled roots that seemed to grab at my ankles. The whispers swirled louder in my ears, a maddening chorus that blurred my vision and made my head spin. I fought to steady my breath, but my limbs felt heavy, as though the night was holding me prisoner beneath its cold cloak. Suddenly, a chill wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, haunting laughter that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. My hands trembled as I gripped the branch, bracing for whatever nightmare lurked in the darkness. I forced myself to stand, every nerve screaming in protest as the shadows thickened around me. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down like a weight. Then, from the darkness, a pair of eyes flashed cold and unblinking, piercing through the gloom, locking onto me with an otherworldly intensity. My breath caught as the figure stepped forward, revealing a pale, gaunt face framed by tangled black hair, eyes hollow yet burning with a cruel intelligence. The world tilted, and my legs nearly gave way. Desperation surged, fight or flight, but my body froze, caught in a trance woven by the creature's gaze. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart, drowning out all other sounds as the entity closed the distance between us. Summoning every last ounce of courage, I forced myself to move, breaking free from the paralysis gripping my limbs. I sprinted toward the faint glow of the cabin's porch light, the creature's unnatural footsteps crashing behind me like a relentless storm. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut and threw the heavy bolt into place, my breath ragged and heart hammering wildly. Outside, the air grew icy cold, and the windows shook violently under a sudden furious wind. I stole a terrified glance through the glass. Only darkness remained. The entity had vanished as mysteriously as it came, but its dreadful presence lingered in the stillness, an unshakable reminder that some nightmares are real and waiting patiently in the shadows. That night, I truly understood fear as something alive, something that watches and waits, and I knew the forest's grasp would haunt me forever.